Hey there, before I start this podcast, I want to let you know about my new YouTube channel which I created. So it's called The World Today. You can search it up on YouTube, The World Today Podcast. You'll see it, you'll recognize my YouTube, my podcast. So go ahead and subscribe to that channel, watch the videos there. I created this YouTube channel so it can be a bigger platform for me and it can be accessible for the people that don't have Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So watch my YouTube videos and continue to support me. I really appreciate it. In today's episode, I've had a phone call with a very special guest, which I'll get to. So go ahead and stay tuned. Hello, guys. Welcome back to another episode of the World Today podcast. In today's episode, we have a very special guest, and it is the Right Honorable Kim Campbell, the 19th Prime Minister of Canada. Miss Campbell, how are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for asking. So, Miss Campbell, tell us about yourself.
Well, I've lived a long life, so telling me about myself would be a long story. But if any of your listeners want to know about me, I have a website, kimcampbell.com. But in 25 words or less, I'm a woman now in my early 70s. I was born and raised in British Columbia, raised in Vancouver. I'm trained as a political scientist. I was a Soviet specialist, and then I became a lawyer. And I've held elected office at all three levels of government, at the school board in Vancouver, in the BC legislature, and in Parliament. And since the 1993 election, where I was defeated, I have spent my career trying to promote democracy and democratic development and the advancement of women in other countries of the world. So I spent a lot of time traveling. And I created the Peter Lougheed Leadership College at the University of Alberta in 2014. That's a program for third and fourth year students. It's been very successful. And I have a brilliant husband, Hershey Felder, who's a concert pianist, playwright, and actor, and I spend as much time as I can with him because he's a very, aside from being a wonderful person, but he's an interesting person. So there you have it in a nutshell.
Well, that's really impressive. So, what was the feeling like when you became Canada's first ever woman prime minister?
Well, to be the first woman Prime Minister of Canada was really pretty wonderful. I was aware that it was a historical breakthrough. I knew that given the timing of the leadership campaign, which was right at the end of the mandate, and the fact that we would have to go immediately into an election, and the fact that our government was not very popular, we've been in office for 2 terms, I knew there was a very strong chance that if I became leader, I wouldn't necessarily be able to win the election, but that it was a historical opportunity. And I found that it was particularly gratifying because it meant a lot to other people. And I still meet people, particularly women, but not just women, who remember when I became prime minister and, they were grade 8 or they were at university or they were, had young children or whatever. And it meant a lot to them. So being the person who could break through that barrier, which was to become the leader of a governing party, which is what it takes, it was quite wonderful. So the short answer was, what was the feeling when you became Canada's first woman prime minister? It was terrific. I was very happy.
Yeah, I mean, we learned in our textbooks that you were a pioneer from becoming the first woman prime minister, and it shows America, because America never had a woman head of state, and you became the first woman head of state for Canada. It shows how progressive Canada is.
Well, it would show how progressive Canada is if I weren't the first and only. I'm still waiting for number 2 and 3 and 4. But, yeah, it's a breakthrough, and I'd like to see more.
Absolutely. So if you had the authority, what steps would you take in order to help the progression of the gender gap issue in employment, not from a social and political standpoint?
Well, I think starting with the second one first, from the political standpoint, I think we need policies that protect women against discrimination. And we have a lot of those. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms protects people from discrimination based on their sex. And I think that there are many policies that try to give women an opportunity to compete in the areas of employment and other areas. But I think what I would say is I'd focus on the social part, because I think what is really important is to understand where the barriers come from. How many of the barriers for women are based on really false attitudes, outdated attitudes, attitudes that are not really supported by the fact. When women do things where women have not been permitted to do them before, people often see them as some kind of an anomaly, but they assume that really men are more suited. But we don't even know the history of many of the women who've done outstanding things, who've been absolute pioneers in the sciences, in maths and physics. I mean, the NASA, the space program in the United States, some of the most key figures in creating that were women and women of color. And if you've seen the movie Hidden Figures, you will understand what I'm talking about. That very often when people don't think that you belong, they forget about you when you make the breakthrough. And in fact, there are a great many women who have been hugely accomplished throughout history that we don't really know about. So I think we need to understand where the barriers come from. We also need to understand, our own, that we all have attitudes based on the landscape in which we grew up. If we grow up in a world where women or people of color or people with disabilities or short people or tall people or whatever kind of people don't do certain things, when those people decide they want to do those things or when they make a breakthrough, even though intellectually, mentally, we may accept that that's a good thing, viscerally, somehow kind of deep in our bones, we're uncomfortable because it doesn't correspond to what we're used to. And sometimes to validate that discomfort or to reconcile it with our conscious views, we find we are extra critical. We don't give the benefit of the doubt. We use a double standard. That's where the double standard is so important when women have to be so much better than men to be accepted, because people are trying to justify their own sense that women don't belong. And it's not just women. My interest in issues relating to racial exclusion and others comes from my experience as a woman, but I can see that these dynamics apply to other things as well. So in answering your question, what would I like to do? I would like to, and I did this when I created the Peter Lougheed Leadership College, I would like to raise people's level of understanding of what social and cognitive psychology tells us about how we think and the origins of many of these barriers, our implicit attitudes, our stereotyping, our cognitive biases of confirmation bias, all the things that lead us to put barriers up to women and other people who are seeking inclusion. And then if we understand how we're all part of the problem, and if we understand where those barriers come from, we can create processes to try and first make people aware of them and eliminate them, but also to account for them. So, for example, there was a very interesting article written a number of years ago by Claudia Golden, who's an economist at Harvard, and she wrote about the way that symphony orchestras audition to hire new musicians. And what she found was orchestras that audition behind a screen, in other words, where the people who are applying for the jobs play behind a screen where the people who are adjudicating them can't see them. So they have no idea whether it's a man or a woman or a person of color or, a good-looking person. They have no idea who that person is.
Yeah.
And when musicians audition behind a screen, the orchestras hire more women. Because if you think you're going to hear a small technique, you'll hear a small technique. The screen filters out all of the preconceptions you have about certain people. So to deal with the gender gap, I would really try to focus on what its sources are and to help all of us, men and women, be more enlightened participants and to understand the way we all, men and women, often put up barriers that make it hard for women to compete fairly.
For sure. So what kind of barriers do they face, though?
Well, I think what barriers they face are low expectations, or the expectation that with the double standards, all the things that are applied to people when people think they don't belong. So, I mean, it's very interesting that something that would be fine for a man to do will be criticized in a woman, not because it's a bad thing, but because people are looking for ways to justify their sense that she doesn't belong. So those are the kind of barriers, double standards in particular. Also, I think there are many ways in which women carry certain kinds of burdens in our society still. in terms of their duties in looking after children, caregivers now, for older people in their families. And I think we need to have services and opportunities for people to get help when they need to be able to have time free, to be able to have some support in meeting their other obligations. Because we know, even though the world is changing, and certainly in Western societies, men have become much more willing to step up and be helpful in the home, but women are still carrying the major burden. And not only does that make it hard for women to manage the work-life balance, but it often means that employers are biased against women and assume that they won't be able to manage things, even if they are able to manage them.
For sure, I understand. So my next question is, do you think that the UN is doing enough for women's rights with the limited power they have? If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will even distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many more other platforms. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need in a podcast in one place. So go ahead and download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Have in the present and historically.
Well, I think the key part of your question is with the limited power they have. The United Nations cannot force countries to do things. It can only create policies and advocate them and provide services in countries where they're allowed to do that. And the creation of UN Women, which is a separate department in the United Nations, which grew out of a smaller department called UNIFEM, I think has been very focused on identifying the needs of women, advocating for the needs of women. Gender equality and support for women and families is a key part of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development Goals of the United Nations. And I think, for example, the UN Security Council has passed some resolutions. They passed some resolutions starting with, I think it was 1325 and then 1810, that required women to be part of the negotiations in post-conflict situations. And the reason they did that was because they found that when there were post-conflict agreements negotiated after wars or civil wars, if women were not part of the process of negotiating them, the agreements usually fell apart, because what they didn't take into account were all the things that women could bring to the table, the understandings that women have of the lives, the way women live them, that could help to make a better agreement. So, for example, after the Angola War, when they cleared the mines off the roads, but if they don't clear the mines off the fields, then people can't produce food, they can't produce agriculture. So if there are no women at the table, there are many things that are not recognized. So the United Nations has strongly recognized the importance of incorporating women. And I think many countries in the UN are very supportive. So I would not give the UN failing marks for what it does for women, but I would say that the key part of your question is, given their limited power, they can call out countries to do things. You see the same thing with climate change. They can be strong advocates for good policy, but at the end of the day, they cannot force countries to do things. I mean, they can provide sanctions and engage in punishment for things that target and are explicitly discriminatory. And so, for example, rape in combat is now considered to be a war crime. So there are ways in which the UN and its agencies stand up for those values. But I think at the end of the day, it's going to be a partner in resolving these issues. And I think that one of the things the UN is very good at is doing research and getting information and helping us to do things in an enlightened way and identifying where there are problems and where resources could be deployed to improve the lives of women. And one of the things we know, I think it's the Pew Social Research body that does some of the very best social research. They say that the best indicator of the social, economic, and political development of a country is the status of its women. That's you want to know how well a country is doing, look at how well the women are doing, because that is absolutely key, both as a cause and an effect of the policies.
For sure. And Canada is actually doing really good in terms of that, because if you heard of Rahaf Mohammed Al Khoon, the girl from Saudi Arabia, that she was traveling with her family, and Canada was the first country to say, we're going to accept her. We're accepting asylum. We're going to accept her asylum.
Yeah.
We're going to bring her to Canada.
Yeah, I think Canada has tried very hard to be a standard bearer for the rights of women. And certainly our current Prime Minister has been very vocal about this. But even going back to my own days in government, our government, I think, was very positive about women. And I'll give you an interesting example that there's a strong link between what we do in countries and what happens internationally. So when I was Minister of Justice back in the early 1990s, I reworked the law of sexual assault in Canada, because it was out of date, and the Supreme Court had struck down a part of it because they thought it was overstepping, and I redid the rape shield provision. Not long after that, the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague declared systematic rape to be a war crime. And I talked to Louise Arbour, who had been the chief prosecutor of the War Crimes Tribunal. She then went on to be the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations. But she said that there was a link between what happened at countries, that having the kind of enlightened legislation that I'm able to bring forward in Canada as Justice Minister set a standard internationally, and other countries were doing similar things, and that those actions by individual countries had an impact on the international norms that global bodies were ready to adopt. So what Canada does is good, not just for women and men living in Canada, because, the rights of women reflect very well on men. I mean, if you're a man, you want to be raised in a family where the women are well respected, because you'll have more intelligent, interesting, and strong families when you have that. So it's not just for the benefit of women, but when we do these policies in Canada, we also provide templates and examples and a standard for the rest of the world. And it provides often hope for other people who are trying to change things in their own countries. But it also empowers global institutions to have higher standards for the protection of women.
For sure, yes. So my last question is, do you think Canada is long overdue for a woman Prime Minister?
Well, I think it is. I was the first, and people say to me, what will it take to have another woman Prime Minister? And I say, to be Prime Minister of Canada, you have to be elected leader of a party that can form a government. So having any party leader is a good thing. And incidentally, we've had, quite a number, I think 12 or 13 women who've been, who've led governments in the provinces and territories. But they don't usually go on to the national level. It's very uncommon in Canada for that to happen. So they are good role models, but they aren't a stepping stone necessarily to be a prime minister. So you need to be elected leader of a party that can form a government. So parties that can't form governments, even if they elect women as leaders, that's great, but that isn't necessarily a step to having a woman prime minister. Since I was prime minister, I think there have been about 15, I have to go back and count them, but at least 15 changes of leadership in the three main parties who could conceivably form a government, the Liberals, the Conservatives, and the NDP. And so you say, out of those 15 leader changes, in how many of those leadership campaigns was a woman candidate even on the final ballot? And I think the answer is in none of them. And I think that's pretty shocking. So I think the political parties have to support women as candidates and in ridings that they can win. And I think they have to support women holding cabinet portfolios. Like I was the first woman Minister of Justice, the first woman, and still the only woman Minister of National Defense. We've never had a woman as the finance minister in Canada. We've had several women as foreign ministers, but women have the opportunity to show what they can do. So I think we are overdue. And even in this current leadership campaign of this Conservative Party, there is no woman in that campaign that seems to have a chance to win. And that is really kind of shocking in the 21st century. So the short answer to your question is yes, I do think it's overdue. And I think we need to deconstruct the process that it takes to put a woman in a position where she's a viable candidate to lead her party, and that party is one that could conceivably form a government. And we're not there yet, but I'm trying to keep as healthy as I can be so that I could be there for the swearing in of the second female Prime Minister of Canada. And I'm hoping that I will see it in my lifetime, and hopefully that will be hopefully pretty soon.
For sure. I would love to interview the second woman Prime Minister of Canada.
Well, I hope you get the chance to do that. I'm rooting for it.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Ms. Campbell. It was an honor for you to be on my podcast. I can't imagine how much of an honor I feel, and how much I'm lost of words for having you on my podcast. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Well, it's a pleasure, Zubair, and thank you for your interest in public policy and in world affairs, and all the best to all of your listeners. I hope that they've learned something, and I hope that they're curious to learn more. And as I say, I have a website, kimcampbell.com, so anybody wants to know anything more about me, I'm easy to find. But thank you very much, dear.
For sure. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.